Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. As concerns your specific question, I think the two principal challenges emanate on the one hand from the developments that we see in Afghanistan, which of course used to be one of the principal producers of opium and heroin. And while we have seen quite a dramatic decrease of opium poppy cultivation in these last years, especially 2023 and 2024, since the Taliban government introduced an opium production ban or a drug production ban in general. Unfortunately, we also have to admit that this reduction in opium production is not resulting in a commensurate reduction of drug trafficking. So when we look at the seizure data of all the neighboring countries, with the exception of Iran, we see either a sideways sort of development in terms of the volumes of drugs that are being seized, or we see even an upward trend in some cases. And basically, that is driven by two critical factors. One is that there are still opium stocks that are available, so opium that was cultivated and harvested before the introduction of the ban. And at the same time, by a massive increase in synthetic drugs. And here, again, two different challenges. One is the fact that synthetic drugs are obviously not being produced exclusively in Afghanistan, but are being produced across the region. And we have evidence of that, in particular in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, through the dismantling of drug labs, especially in the last 2 years. And on the other hand, of course, because of synthetic drugs being replacing to a large extent the opium market in a very rapid fashion. So these are sort of like the key two trends that we observe, and these constitute some significant challenges for the Uzbek and of course for the Central Asian authorities. Now, in terms of some of the gaps that make it difficult to tackle this new challenge, one definitely relates to basically the absence of sufficient forensic capabilities. So when authorities seize drugs, especially new psychotropic substances, they may not have the necessary forensic capabilities to actually analyze them quickly and effectively to bring forward charges. We also see quite some challenges with regard to sustaining border security, because of course much of the trafficking comes across the land borders, and there we see quite some challenges, in particular along the very long border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, but also to a lesser extent on the borders with Uzbekistan. And then I think we need also to be very aware of the nature of the drug trafficking networks. And here I think the question arises whether the authorities of the countries here in the region really are already capable of conducting very complex investigations that are not only going after those people that are caught while, for example, transiting a border or in the areas around the border, but basically to dismantle and to fully investigate the drug trafficking networks that are behind these borders, especially the financiers of these big trafficking cases, which rarely come in direct contact with the drugs in the first place. So conducting these complex investigations and investigating, arresting, prosecuting, and convicting effectively those that are involved is a very important element of the counter-drug trafficking strategy, and of course also going after the proceeds of those illicit trades. So these are sort of like overall some of the challenges that they're facing. Quite a bit is linked also to legislative gaps that still, I think, could be filled in full alignment with the various conventions, for example, that Uzbekistan and the various neighboring countries are already parties to, or conventions or protocols that they should be signing at this stage. Well, our support to Uzbekistan and to the other countries in Central Asia, and of course also the other neighbors of Afghanistan, is really can be divided in sort of like 4 or 5 categories. There's a lot of capacity building, training, creating essentially the skill sets in the frontline professionals to effectively counter drug trafficking, detect drug trafficking. There are, let's say, the category of more technical and policy advisory services to governments in terms of the strategic direction of the counter-trafficking effort, to develop national action plans, as we just supported, for example, Uzbekistan in doing so. Then there's the component of providing specialized equipment to detect, for example, to analyze drugs, also forensics, we just talked about it, building up forensic labs. We are providing a lot of research support. All the numbers with regard to opium poppy cultivation for seizure data, much of it is basically produced by UNODC, and of course in support of the countries in the region. And finally, of course, mounting awareness campaigns, both designing them and implementing them, and other preventive efforts, which I think we're still going to be touching upon in the course of this conversation. Well, the ones that we are directly involved in is a couple of awareness campaigns, which we have been mounting through our own means, and of course in partnership with entities such as the National Commission for Drug Control, the NCDC. We are also very proudly associated with a regional youth network, which has, of course, also a chapter in Uzbekistan. And that youth network has been extremely active in designing their own campaigns, and we have been, of course, trying to support them to the best of our abilities. But I think much more important is what they do by themselves. And one of the initiatives that they just have mounted very recently is actually the design of a public opinion poll among young peoples on attitudes and actual exposure to drugs at this stage. I think this will provide us critical insights on what is actually happening and how are our young people confronted with the issue of availability of drugs, what is their knowledge of drugs, what is their attitude towards drug use. Because all of this information we need to know in order then to be able to design our awareness campaigns and other preventive measures to actually be effectively addressing whatever the problem might be in this regard. I think it will be unavoidable because just as we are using technology to combat, also the bad people are using technology to advance their own objectives. You see it in particular through the massively increased drug dealing that happens in the internet, on the darknet. So criminals are using the internet increasingly, and we are actually, if anything, in most cases, we are running a little bit behind them, trying to catch up. One very important step that has been taken by the member states of the United Nations is actually to adopt very recently the first cybercrime, international cybercrime convention. And that convention will tackle both issues, the cyber-enabled crimes, so really attacks basically on cyber infrastructure, and the cyber-dependent crimes, which are the ones that are basically attacking the infrastructure, and then the cyber-enabled crimes, which is all crimes that are now being committed also using the internet. And we see this actually in all the mandate areas of UNODC, whether we're talking about corruption, whether we're talking about countering terrorism, whether we're talking about trafficking in persons. A very significant part of the crime has already migrated into the cyberspace and is committed there. Obviously, a very definite answer is the second category. We need to go after the organizers, we need to go after the traffickers. The drug users, and I think the international community has been very clear on this in various political declarations, that the world drug problem is first and foremost a health problem, and we need to address it as such. Drug users are people who live with a drug use disorder, which is a health condition. And as such, they need access to medical treatment, which in many countries is not available or not available in a commensurate way to the problem. We see that also here in the region, that, for example, access is available to some extent to men and boys, to a much lesser extent to women. There might be access gaps that are linked to the non-availability of structures, but there's also access gaps that are linked to stigma and the relative inacceptability, if you want to say so, of women and girls using drugs as opposed to men. So it is much more difficult for them to basically go to structures for various reasons. And there's more modern approaches that could lessen that stigma and that could lessen that access barrier that we are seeing at the moment. To my mind, that's exactly the way where we need to go. Actually, obviously, prevention is much better than going after drug treatment or going after criminals. If we can reduce the propensity of society, and of course starting with young people, towards drug use, I think we are on the right path. And there's some very, very encouraging examples worldwide of programs, especially school-based programs, that have been very effective in building what we are referring typically to as basic life skills. So, for example, young people, how do you deal with peer pressure? How do you deal with stress? How do you deal with issues of acceptability in a group and things like that? All drivers, typically, of drug use. We have these programs that build these life skills, and in those countries where they have been implemented, they have actually been able to reduce somewhere between 30 to 50% first-time drug use. So these kind of programs would be, I'm absolutely convinced, hugely effective for Uzbekistan and for the other countries in Central Asia, but we need yet to implement them. So there is no at the moment structured approach in the schools to target young people and educate them about the dangers of drug use. And I do strongly believe that the government should look into the options that have been created, including by issues such as the Ishanj Fund, the returned monies to Uzbekistan that have been stolen by previous people in power, to use those funds to not only build schools or to renovate schools, but also to equip the teachers with the necessary skills and teaching tools to implement such kind of programs. I feel it is probably needed to add it to the school curriculum. I think it is very important, and it is also very important that, for example, social workers and health workers in schools are sensitized to issues of drug use. Because one thing we need to be, I think, relatively realistic about in this modern society and in an open society, these young people already know a lot of things, and in most cases actually much more about drugs than we do. So what we need to do is basically to educate them about the dangers of drug use, the actual implications of drug use, and most importantly actually of sort of indirectly give them, as I said, those life skills that will insulate them against drug use and the temptations of drug use, and also other antisocial conduct like violence, gender-based violence, prevention of violent extremism. These programs help with a whole range of potential antisocial conduct that we see sometimes among young people.